GARE. Hashtag GARE. 30 years broadcasting Mets games, and somehow you've reached your apex. A guest on Rain Delay Theater.
Somehow I think it's not the apex, but, to this point, at least so far.
All right, well, we want to talk, obviously, a lot about you.
I have a question, though, right
Well,
on the
okay,
beginning.
all right.
When hashtag GARE became a thing, did that finally realize your dream as a viral superstar?
Actually, I had no earthly idea that it happened. I had some inkling that I think Mark Carrig was involved in the
he was
evolution
the father
of
of
that.
it.
He
I
was,
think.
yeah.
Yeah, and that came out of Sunday brunch with Mark, which is something that I mourn the passing of.
It was a little uncomfortable how clearly you enjoyed your time with Mark, and then when Wayne and I would come and try and sit with you guys at brunch on Sundays, it was an icy reception, let's put it that way.
You mean you perceived Mark and myself having a relationship much like you and Wayne?
Yes, kind of.
There was a certain
we think-
exclusivity
Yeah,
to
we
it.
try and bring people in, though, I think. No?
Sometimes.
Maybe,
yeah.
if they're worthy.
I don't
can
know. I
be
think your
inclusive.
wives feel frozen out. So.
Well, they should. But so I'll be honest with you. That was going to be my first question is when Wayne and I came onto the scene at the same time, full time in 2015, when was the moment where you went from saying, oh, it's nice, they have a nice friendship, they're new here, I'm glad they have some friends, to this is weird. This is a little too much.
I think it was the first plane flight when you guys were sharing the blanket.
That was only like in June.
Yeah, that took a couple of months. Oh, my goodness. But, the friendship is real.
Sure.
And
So is the podcast.
the podcast is real, and now we have you on it.
Well, that's
So-
how we got from
so-
friendship to podcast through rain delays. I remember avoiding you assiduously those first couple of rain delay theaters.
You did, but then you really made
Yeah,
history.
he's kind
on
of a
that
jumper
one.
on here. He's,
Right.
he's a bandwagon.
No,
jumper.
he isn't, because remember early on we did maybe the second or third rain delay
Yeah.
where Mark Carrig didn't have your phone number and he was nervous to ask for your phone number. So we said we're going to make it happen. And as we're talking about this live on Rain Delay Theater, you just happened to pop in behind us. And remember, it was one of the great
In Atlanta.
in
It was in
Atlanta.
Atlanta. All the
Yeah,
rain
it's a
delay
very-
theaters have happened in Atlanta. Yes.
It's a very memorable moment. But let's get to you, GARE. 30 years on the job, like I said. This for you was the dream job from the time you were a kid. So even though you've been doing it as long as you have, do you still get moments throughout seasons where it's pinch me, I can't believe this is my actual life?
Let me first clear something up. My dream jobs were shortstop for the Mets, power forward for the Knicks. Okay.
So you settled, is what you're saying.
I'm just saying that it became clear early on that those things were not going to happen. So I guess the next dream job, it was the tertiary dream, was something along these lines.
So it's no big deal then.
You know what I'd say? I would say that during the 15 years that I worked with Bob Murphy, because I had listened to him, under my pillow from the time I was 6 years old, almost every day there was a pinch me moment, right? Oh my goodness, I can't believe that I'm sitting here broadcasting Mets games with Bob Murphy. That was pretty unbelievable.
Why did broadcasting become an avenue for you to begin with?
Well, when I was 9 years old, I got an AM radio in my bedroom. That was like a big deal, right? I recall having heard stuff before that. In fact, I was so into sports as a little kid, listening on the radio, watching on TV, that if we were like in the car and a game came on, my parents were so, I don't know if they were concerned or anxious that I was going to be going too far down the rabbit hole, they would switch the station and put on music, or something else, or turn it off. But I did get that first radio when I was 9, and I quickly discovered that you could, listen to everything under the sun. Marv Albert was my guy. He did the Knicks and Rangers on the radio then. Al Albert doing the Nets. Bob Lindsay and Ralph doing the Mets. I would also listen to, out-of-town stations as much as you could in New York. It's not as easy as it is some other places. But I'd, pick up Chuck Thompson doing the Orioles, or By Sam doing the Phillies, or Ned Martin doing the Red Sox. And, I fell in love with the medium of radio as much as sports on the radio. And that's kind of how it all got started.
Was it something that you were consciously trying to develop as you fell in love with these broadcasters? Did you think, I like this, I want to try this? Or was it just an affinity for what they were doing, and almost subconsciously you ended up picking things
Well,
up.
it's interesting. What I first did when I started listening, as I would keep score, and I don't mean just for baseball games. I would keep score of football games, like
Really?
play-by-play and yards and all that off the radio, which is crazy when you think about it. I would do the same with basketball, hockey games. I'd do all that, just sitting there taking notes as the games were going along. I don't think I ever thought it was possible to be one of those guys. It never really occurred to me until I got to college and the opportunity presented itself. So I wasn't one of those guys who would turn down the sound on the TV and do play-by-play. I know Howie did that, but I never was inclined to do that. Because again, in my mind, I was still trying to be that shortstop or that power forward, but complete lack of skill in baseball and lack of any height, and so
Prevented it.
Yeah, so those dreams dissipated in my mid-teens, but I don't think until I got to college that I really thought that it was actually possible to go on the air and be one of those guys. And it was the first week of my freshman year in college. There was a little posting in the student newspaper saying, if you want to be the voice of the Quakers, I was at Penn my freshman year, and come to this meeting. And I came to the meeting, and 64 people also came to the meeting, and they said, well, if you want to do this, grab a tape recorder and go do a game. And I grabbed my tape recorder, took a couple of buddies, and we sat in the upper deck at Franklin Field to watch a Penn Lafayette football game and talked into a microphone really for the first time.
I've read that you still have that tape.
Somewhere in my attic, that tape exists. I haven't seen it in years. I'm hoping that it wasn't thrown out along the way, but I do believe that that tape still exists.
When was the last time you listened to it?
Probably shortly after I started with the Mets, so probably we're talking 25, 30 years ago. But when I was coming up to this point, I would listen to it occasionally because it really helped keep me humble because it's so unearthly bad. You need to remember where you came from.
How'd you get good? When did those processes begin? How did you take the steps to become a good and then great broadcaster?
Well, we can differ on whether great has been arrived at, but
We'll talk for you there. Pretty great.
I will tell you the most important person in my life in terms of my development is a guy no one's ever heard of. His name is Gary Sparber, and we worked together at a radio station in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And he was the sports director, and I was his number 2 guy. And Gary was one of these guys who had this crystal clear voice and this really easy manner about him. He eventually became the voice of the Charlotte Hornets when they first started out. But he was the guy who told me that if you want to be successful, you have to be yourself. You can't be an announcer on the air. There has to be warmth to you. And it took me a long time to figure that out, but he was the guy who really pointed me in the right direction. And I think without him, I never would have gotten here.
Would you listen to yourself on a daily basis, and would you do a game and then go back and pick it apart, or is it something where you would just kind of in the moment be thinking, I like this, I don't like this, and develop that way?
When I started doing minor league baseball, I started listening to every game. I think up until that point, I wasn't doing enough games. My career didn't really start in sports. My first job was working for Sports Phone, which is not really applicable to anything.
And you were still in school then, right?
Yeah.
Did you take some time off?
Well,
or is that not a good
well,
story?
no, actually, I have no problem with the story. I was at Columbia and doing games for the college station, and a friend of mine, Russ Behrman, was working for Sports Phone, and I needed a part-time job, and he recommended me, and I got a part-time gig. And like a month later, the next semester was starting, and I hadn't completed a couple of papers from the prior semester. And like the same day, they offered me a full-time job at Sports Phone, so it was like kismet, right? I went to the dean, I said I need some time off. I went to Sports Phone, I said I'll take the full-time job, and I took about a year and a half off from school before I went back and finished my
Now,
degree.
this is a podcast. We kind of skew to have a younger audience off of social
You're going to ask what
media.
sports phone is, yeah.
is.
What the hell is sports phone?
And I'll further the question, because it's not just what is sports phone. If you're in this business in New York, you've heard enough stories about sports phone. But it seems like so many of the mainstays in this city in sports broadcasting got their start at sports phone as well.
That's definitely true. I mean, Howie worked at sports phone. Al Troutwood worked at sports phone. Bob Papa, I think, worked at sports. But there are a lot of guys. Before the internet, and even before full-time all sports radio, there were very few ways of getting up-to-date scores of games unless the game was actually on TV or on the radio. So particularly for games that were happening in other markets, you had to wait for WCBS or WINS to do their quarter-hour sports reports. So you go a full half hour without being able to get an update. So the beauty of sports phone was you called the number, and the scores were updated every 10 minutes during peak hours, and you got the latest scores, which let's face it, it catered to gamblers more than anybody else. But it was actually pretty good training just for speaking, if not on the radio, at least on tape, and trying to enunciate, because you had 58 seconds to sometimes get 30 scores in, which is, try and do it sometime. It's not easy, but it really helped me because I had a few speech impediments as a kid, and this really helped me break those and really enunciate well. And but it was there weren't that many jobs available, entry-level jobs in sports broadcasting, and for a kid who was trying to make it in the business, and making your $5 an hour reading scores at sports phone was a nice first step.
So you say you had some speech impediments as a kid. Did that ever, in your mind, make you wonder if it was even possible to be a sports broadcaster?
I don't think that I really knew that I had speech impediments until I did that first game at Penn, that freshman football game, and listened back to the tape and heard me try to say the word Lafayette, or the two words Lafayette Leopards. I had a lazy L, and I could not pronounce the letter L properly.
Really?
And it got me to really work on.
Can you imitate it? What did it sound like?
It sounded like Lafayette Leopards, kind of like Tom Brokaw.
Really?
But Tom was able to make it pretty big in the business.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Yeah, Tom
I'd
did
say
fine.
so.
But it was definitely a problem, and I also had I had a New York-ish accent, which I also kind of had to work to break.
How long did it take you to break those habits?
I think it took over the span of a few years while I was in college to do that. I took a couple of speech classes, which helped, and it evolves over the years.
Were there times in the minor leagues for you, and I know you were with the team in Pawtucket, you had some time with the Durham Bulls. Were there times for you where you thought you would be a minor league baseball announcer for a longer period of time than you ended up being?
I would not have been. No, I mean, I did some part-time games in Spartanburg when I was working there, but that was maybe 20 games a year for a couple of years. My first full-time baseball gig was in Durham, which was an A-ball team at the time. That was in '86, and I did that for 1 year. And then I went to Pawtucket, and I did 2 years there. And by the middle of the second year, I had pretty much decided that I would maybe give it one more year after that, and then I'd have to find something else to do.
Why did you make that decision?
Minor league, there's a reason they call it the minor leagues.
It's tough.
I mean, it's really tough, and I have tremendous respect for the people like my friend Jim Weber in Toledo, who's been there for almost 40 years now as the voice of the Mud Hens, maybe more than 40 years.
Yeah, at this point, yeah.
And I don't know how they do it. It's really, really hard. The travel is hellacious at every level. Even at AAA, where you're flying, you're playing a night game, going back to your hotel, getting a 4 a.m. wake-up call to make a 6 o'clock flight to connect to go somewhere else to play the next night. I mean, for somebody in their 20s, which I was at the time, it's tough enough, but I can't imagine people doing it in their 40s and 50s.
Now, when you were in Pawtucket, I believe it was Pawtucket, you got a call from the Mets to come fill in for a game, and you were told you couldn't do it, correct? Was that in Pawtucket?
That did happen in Pawtucket, yeah. The people I worked for in Pawtucket were, interestingly enough, because Pawtucket is 45 minutes from Boston, they're very, everybody in Pawtucket is a Red Sox fan, which isn't always true in every AAA town, right?
Right.
I'm sure the people in Las Vegas the last few years were not necessarily Mets fans. They were just, they were Las Vegas 51s fans. But they were very into development and getting players to the big leagues. It was a badge of honor for them, whereas a lot of AAA teams are like, no, don't take our players. We don't want them to go to the major leagues. We want to keep them for ourselves. So when I got the call from the Mets broadcasting director, Mike Ryan, that they had an opening because Gary Thorne was doing Devils games, and they were in the playoffs, so he was missing a few games. So they called me to do a game, and I was elated, and I went to my boss in Pawtucket, and I said, I'm going to be your next guy who's going to the big leagues. And they said, what date? And I said, well, whatever date it was. And they said, we have a game that night. You can't go. I said, I thought we were all about development. So the response was, no, it wouldn't be fair to our sponsors. So I had to go back, tail between my legs, and call Mike Ryan back and tell him I couldn't do it. And he said, well, if anything else comes up, I'll give you a call. Fortunately, the Devils kept winning, and a couple of weeks later, Mike Ryan called again. He said, if the Devils win this round, we'll have another opening on May the 4th. And miracle of miracles, if you've ever looked at a minor league schedule, Pawtucket was actually off on May 4th.
Wow. One of probably 8 off days
There
they had
are
that
no
year,
off
yeah.
days in the minor league. So I had to root for the Devils to get through the next round. I had to listen to a fading radio signal when they were playing Game 7. They had a lead. They lost the lead. The signal faded out. But they won the game. I got the chance, and that was my first.
Did you think, though, sorry, just really quickly, did you think when you were originally told no, and in that moment, that was my shot?
Yes.
And I don't have it. Yeah.
Yes. And I will give my boss in Pawtucket credit. He said, if you're good enough, you'll get plenty of chances. This is not really a shot. You'll get a real shot. And, I can't tell you that game that I did in '88 was my audition. I got the job the next year after Gary Thorne left. But it certainly helped. And, but when I was turned down initially, I definitely thought that might have been the one shot.
What was your plan if the Mets didn't come along, if the big leagues didn't work out?
Wow, I didn't really have a plan, to be honest. I was very fortunate the winter after the '88 season. I actually got 3 major league job offers from the Expos.
Such a bragger.
I'm just telling you the truth. From the Expos, the Padres, and the Mets. But the way it happened was that the Expos offered it to me first. The Padres called me and flew me out there and offered me the job on the spot, and I hadn't heard back from the Mets. And so I didn't know what to do. I had to.
So what did you do? What did you say?
I stalled. I did a humana, and I kept calling the Mets to ask for an answer, and it got a little dicey. I was afraid the San Diego thing was going to go away, and I was going to be left with nothing.
Yeah, how tough is that to? It's one thing to have the opportunity to broadcast major league games,
Right.
which is the first goal, but
course.
it was always the Mets for you. So
Well, although San Diego had a few charms too.
maybe looking back at it, but in the moment, how difficult is that to, again, just in that moment, wait it out and try and play it?
I would have, if the Mets, it came down to right before Christmas, and if the Mets hadn't given me an answer, I would have had to say, I can't wait any longer and taking the Padres job.
You would have ended up with a Murphy brother nonetheless, whether it was Jack Murphy in San Diego, Jack Murphy Stadium, or with Bob Murphy.
Let me just tell you that the guy they hired for that job
Yeah.
was Rick Monday after I turned it down, and they eliminated the job like 2 years later. So I might have been out on the street.
Rick Monday still got a job, though.
He does.
He held on to his
he
broadcasting career.
He ended up in a good place. But if you're asking me what my plan of action was if baseball hadn't worked out or if sports broadcasting hadn't worked out, I guess my stock answer is I probably would have ended up in law school, but I definitely wouldn't have been happy about it.
When you get the job with the Mets, and you've said it, you had many pinch me moments sitting next to Murph. How long did it take for you to feel like now you were really a part of it? That you weren't just sitting next to the legend, that you were part of this now?
That's hard to say. One fortunate thing happened my first year with the Mets. The spring of 1989, obviously our games were on WFAN, and that was the last spring before Mike and the Mad Dog happened. So WFAN was very anxious to have as many Mets games on those weekday afternoons because they didn't have a highly rated show in the afternoon. So we did 23 spring training games that year.
Oh, wow.
Which gave me a good chance to settle in with Murph and kind of feel comfortable. Now, I will say this, I got really comfortable in those 23 spring training games, and then opening day arrived and Murph's blinders went on and things changed a little bit. But it at least made me feel as though I knew what was going on. I spent a lot of time in the clubhouse getting to know the players. I was probably at spring training for 6 weeks that year. And as you know, I'm not a huge fan of spending a lot of time in spring training these days. But back then, it was vital, and it helped me get settled.
Can you believe that it's been 30 years? This is a milestone year for you. When you look back at those times, those first spring training games with Bob Murphy, can you believe that much time has passed, that you've been doing this for this long?
No, not really. Funny that time tends to be like an accordion. The more years you have, the more it gets compressed. I can think back and separate some of those years, but a lot of it's just a blur, and I think also, the first 15 years were distinct because I worked with Murph. The next 2 years were distinct because I worked with Howie, which was just an incredible experience. It was almost like sharing your brain with somebody, because our backgrounds were so similar, and we had so much fun those 2 years. And then the SNY years, which were an entirely distinct thing over the last 13. So I guess I would compartmentalize it that way, but no, in total it doesn't really seem that long.
You've talked already on this interview, but I know you always talk about how much you love the medium of radio. Was it difficult to make that choice to go to SNY, take that new opportunity, and try TV?
It was terribly difficult, but I had 5 kids to put through college. I mean, let's be honest. I would have stayed in radio forever. I would have. But, if I was ever going to go to TV, that was the right moment. I knew the subject matter. The network was starting from scratch. It seemed like it was meant to be. So, I'm still very much a radio chauvinist. I still try and do as much radio as I can during the off season to keep my hand in it. But circumstances were what they were.
What did it take for you to get, when you're especially in a 3-man booth as the play-by-play guy, you're the quarterback or the point guard, whatever kind of distributor that you want to think about. When you have Keith Hernandez and Ron Darling, who've had certainly great baseball careers, but were kind of novices when it came to broadcasting at the beginning, what did it take for you to get all you guys on the same page?
Well, what helped, Wayne, I think, is that we were all novices, right? I was a TV novice. Ronnie was TV novice. Keith had done more than both of us combined on television, but he was only, dabbling at that time. So we were all kind of starting from scratch, and I think that really helped. We all knew we needed each other to swim rather than sink. I love the 3-man booth. I think it's the greatest thing because I have to do this. I don't have to do as much, And what also helps is, and it's an amazing thing when you consider I've got a borderline Hall of Famer in one chair and one of the best pitchers in Mets history in the other chair, is that there are no egos in that booth. Yeah. And the reason why a lot of 3-man booths don't work is because one guy has to have the mic, right? Or 2 guys are competing for the mic. And that basically never happens in our booth. We're all very happy to defer to the other. And I think that's part of why it works.
Do you remember, I know saying a moment is very difficult to just pinpoint one thing, but do you remember a time period where you felt, this is really something special? Because the 3 of you have become iconic. So how long did it take for you to internally recognize that this was not just your run-of-the-mill booth.
Yeah, I don't think I ever look at things that way. I think that's for other people to judge, and I don't mean that to be humble in any way. I just think that, we all have what we think we do well, but how other people perceive it could be very different from the way we perceive it internally, or even as a group internally. We might think we're doing the best job in the world, and most people might think something completely differently. So I leave the judgments to other people. I'm just happy that it seems as though people enjoy the broadcast.
Everybody knows you as a guy who knows everything when it comes to what's going on in baseball.
Second guy. No.
Second guy.
I defer to Howie.
Well, I mean, on the TV broadcast.
When we're talking about Mets
Right.
history, I defer to Howie every time. First of all, he's older than me. I
He
want to
is.
make that point.
Yeah, no, there's no
Can
doubt.
we say that into the camera, please? Howie Rose is older than Gary Cohen.
But it brings me to a different point, because my favorite thing about the Mets is that people have lived their entire history. Like, you can go all the way back to 1962, and people remember every single season that they've ever had. And I think that's very unique compared to franchises that are much older than them. For you and for Howie and your relationship, how much does that history kind of play into you guys together and how your careers have developed?
Well, I think, even though we took very different paths to get here, the fact of the matter is we kind of started in the same place. We both grew up in Queens. We both adopted the Mets early on. Howie a little earlier than I. Did I mention he's older than I am? But that's why those 2 years that we worked together in 04 and 05 were so special, because it was almost like talking to your brother for 162 games, and because we shared so many of those same experiences. Whereas, now, in a lot of cases, I'm relating experiences to Keith and Ron, who might not know firsthand what I'm talking about. Just as they can relate to me things that happened on the field in the clubhouse that I'm not privy to. But it's different, right? I mean, we're all bringing something different to the table, as opposed to when I was with Howie and we would bounce things back and forth and each be able to add more detail to things that we shared separately growing up, but things that we ultimately shared together.
Well, whether you know more or Howie knows more, Howie, the older guy, knows more, it's incredible to me, even now, having been on the broadcast for 5 years, just how much you do know and how much you can recall. And I always say that I tell Wayne this all the time, my job, the way I view it, is to try and find something that Gary does not know, which is nearly impossible.
No, I think you do a very good job.
Well,
of
I'm
that.
getting there. But for people who have no idea, they only see the finished product, what is the level of prep work that you do on a daily basis that goes beyond just what you know off the top of your head from watching the Mets all your life?
Yeah, I think, well, in baseball, so organic, right? I mean, you're talking about a sport that for 7 months during the season and then even during the off season changes every day. So I think, if you're going to be a credible source, you have to be up on everything, not just as far as the Mets are concerned, but as far as the sport is concerned and all 30 teams. So, I'll spend a couple of hours in the morning just reading it. Let me just say parenthetically, the preparation has changed astronomically because, when I first started, the way you prepared for a game is by watching the CNN headline sports with Jerome Jurenovich giving you two seconds of highlights and going out and buying USA Today and getting the little team-by-team blurbs to know something about what was going on with other teams. Did a lot more calling people in those days and, finding out things that way. But there was no internet. You couldn't. There wasn't 24-hour sports. There was, ESPN was just, it gave you bits and pieces, but it wasn't as baseball focused as you would have liked to be as versed in it as you wanted to be. So, now the problem is figuring out what not to read as opposed to trying to find sources to read. So, I guess I'd put it this way. I don't want to be in a position where the people watching know more than I do. And I guess that's the challenge every day because everybody has access to the same things that I do. I, obviously have access to the clubhouse and access to the manager and, know things internally here that I can relate that people don't know. But in terms of the general baseball knowledge, it's out there. So you have to stay ahead of the curve.
What did you learn about Bob Murphy that maybe people don't really know about him?
Well, Bob was a very private guy, so we didn't learn a lot. But there were a few moments that occurred over the 15 years we worked together that almost brought me to my knees. One was that Bob revealed, Bob wrote left-handed and kept score left-handed, but he revealed that he was actually a natural right-hander, and that the reason that he wrote with his left hand is because when he was a youngster growing up in Oklahoma, he was chasing after an ice truck and fell and broke his elbow, which is a pretty good story, right? It's kind of similar to the Billy Wagner story, right? Because Billy was a right-hander who became left-handed. But the kicker was, and Murph said this, and I have to take it as gospel, he said, this was in Oklahoma in the 30s, whatever. He said, yeah, I broke my elbow, and they replaced it with a goat's knee.
And he was dead serious.
He was not, Murph didn't fool around. If he said he has a goat's knee in his right elbow, he had a goat's knee in his right elbow.
So Bob Murphy was part human, part goat.
That's the best that I can put it.
That's unbelievable.
And the other piece about his childhood that I learned was, he and I don't remember how this came up, that he went to school every day on a horse, which is not, again, not unexpected growing up in Oklahoma in the 1930s. But the horse was a blind mare. To which I, of course, asked, how did she know where she was going? Well, she just knew.
Amazing.
Well, when I asked that, I didn't know that Bob Murphy would have the goat's knee in his arm. That's pretty good.
Let's do, since we're running low on time, some quick hitters here about your 30 years. I want to start, you did ask me right before we came on, you said, I'm really curious to see what research you guys have done about me. Okay, so here's the big one that I got.
Uh-oh.
Who has been better analysts to work with, Ron and Keith or George Stephanopoulos?
Well, George and I worked together briefly when I was in college. He was 2 years behind me, and George was actually more a wrestler than a broadcaster. That was his main pursuit at Columbia. But he did work at WKCR, and we did do some soccer games together. And the one thing you have to know about George as a college guy, he was very quiet.
Really?
He barely spoke, and so I had to, kind of had to draw him out on the air. So.
How about that? Does it surprise you then what he became and what he's doing now?
He very quickly out of college, moved up the political operative chain, and we fell out of touch. And when he started showing up, doing, being the political operative on TV, and then later as a commentator, he learned his lessons well. Good for George.
Good for George. What was your favorite season to call and why?
1999. It's not even close. You have to remember, I got here in 1989. The previous 4 years were the greatest 4-year period in Mets history, right? 95, they won 98 games and just fell short against the Cardinals.
Did you feel responsible that when you got into 89 that they started to slide?
Well, let me just say that it was not expected that they would slide when I got there. But, 85 they were great. 86 they won it. 87 they had all the injuries. 88 they get to the 7th game of the LCS. I mean, when I got there in 89, I was coming to a winning program that was expected to win in perpetuity. And it didn't quite work out that way. We went through a 10-year fallow period where the Mets didn't make the postseason. So, and fell just a shade short in both 97 and 98. So when 99 happened, that was big because there were so many exciting games, so many great finishes, and in those days, excuse me, Murph and I were were switching innings every day. So like one day he would do the first 2 and the last 2, and the next day I would do the first 2 and the last 2. So it just happened that all the great finishes fell into my lap.
Right.
It was just luck of the draw. So that really enhanced it. And then, they were down by 2 games going to the final weekend, and it looked like they weren't going to make it. And then, they swept the Pirates, and the Reds lost the games they needed to lose, and they ended up in a 1-game playoff. And, then you had the Todd Pratt home run against the Diamondbacks, and all the, down 3-0 against the Braves and come back, and the grand slam single, and even the horrible way the season ended in Game 6 in Atlanta. There was so much to that season, and so many highlights that flashed through my brain more than any other year. And just the not having been there before after 10 years of being on the air, that one always will stand out.
It's very similar to our first season where the Mets
Yeah,
went to the World
pretty
Series.
good.
Yeah, we had to wait. We had to wait
We
like
had
6 months.
We really did.
I felt really bad for you.
I'm glad that you said that about how you switched innings with Bob Murphy, because when I hear all those highlights from '99, it's always you, and I've always thought to myself, where's Bob Murphy? How did Gary get all these innings?
Yeah, the one that wasn't was the playing game against the Reds. Murph had that one, and he called that.
Do you have a favorite moment? Doesn't need to be from that year, but a favorite moment over your 30 years? I know it's really tough to
Yeah,
pinpoint.
I don't really do moments. To me, the job is so much about how you do the 500 hours, right? Not how you do the 10 seconds.
Yeah.
I mean, the great moments, the great plays lead to great calls, right? But there's so much mundane stuff that goes on for 3 hours every night for 6 months that you're trying to punctuate or describe, depending on if it's TV or radio, the best way you can. To me, that's what it's the trying to be consistently good every night and be somewhat original in what you're doing, and try and enhance the game at hand, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. And from a business sense, right, you're trying to keep people watching longer even when the game isn't the greatest. So to me, that's what I value more than the odd home run call or something like that.
So that being said, you may have just answered this question, but has there ever been a call that you said, I wish I had a chance to do that again?
I'd never do that. But at the same time, though, I'm sure I could do every call better than I did. But that's the beauty of it live, right? You never know what's coming up. I mean, there are some things you can't anticipate, right? Like a team's about to clinch. You might have something in your mind, or something comes to you. But then there are the things you can't possibly prepare for, right? And you're trying to do the best you can in the moment, and you may not find the exact right word, but you hope that you find the right sentiment or the right tone, or maybe you just mess it up completely. But you don't get it back because it is live, and that's the beauty of it.
Our social media question this week comes from a woman named Colleen. She refers to herself as Auntie Colleen. I don't know if she's one of your aunts. But she wants to know if you're ever planning to write a book about either your career or your life or broadcasting itself.
Well, Auntie Colleen, and she's not my my aunt by blood.
By blood.
I hate to write. That's the one thing you need to know about me. I do not enjoy writing, and so it is almost certain that I will never write a book.
Fair enough.
Keith could be your ghostwriter.
Keith writes, Howie writes,
Ron's got a book.
Johnny
Ron
writes. I'm sure you'll write a book. You.
Sure, yeah.
Everybody's got a book in
Yeah,
them,
why
but
not?
my
course.
book's not coming
We'll
out.
co-author a book. It
Right.
won't be. It has to be.
Rain Delay
co-author.
Theater, the
The
book.
book. It's going to be an empire. Rain Delay Theater.
I hope you've copyrighted that.
Can we?
Probably should.
We probably should try.
Probably should work
Yeah.
on it. Last thing, people might not know this about you. I don't know why they would, but you have an incredible tie collection. That you never wear the same tie twice in a season, right?
I feel like that one I've seen, though.
Well, maybe last year you
Not
saw.
this year.
Not this year. How many
Are you sure?
How many ties do you have, and when did you make that decision? I'm not going to wear the same.
First
tie.
of all, you have to know that when I started in television in 2006, I owned one suit and one tie. Okay, so I was
Okay.
not a clothes guy, and I still am
So
not
what
a
would you wear
clothes guy.
when you would come to the radio? Just polos all the time?
To the
To the radio, when you would come to the ballpark?
Yeah,
just
I
polos.
wear
all-
whatever.
I guess Howie never wears a tie. Opening
Wears
day.
those
Why
shirts
would
with the
he?
funny.
No, I mean
symbol on.
there was a time that that we had to wear proper clothing on the flights, so when the team traveled, so I had to buy a couple more ties, but I started accumulating ties after I started the TV thing, and I didn't want to be, didn't want to be repeating.
Yeah.
And you can only mix up your suits and your shirts so much, but ties give you a chance to give a little different panache to the day.
So how many would you say you have?
Probably about 250,
200.
and probably about 40 or 50 of them are in a blue and orange theme. So
Smart.
I try and throw in a blue and orange once a series when we're wearing.
That
Where
looks
do-
like a Seton Hall tie. That
That's
you're wearing right
definitely
now.
a Seton
No,
Hall
there's yellow in it, so that would not qualify.
Where are
Where
these
is it?
ties? Where are they? Where do you store them?
In a closet.
Very organized though.
Yeah,
Are
are
they
they-
folded? Are they hanging?
Well, they're
You're
hanging.
a radio guy. Give us some description.
Okay, I didn't realize that this was a thing.
Oh, why not?
I actually have, you can take about 20 ties and put them concentrically around a hanger, and they hang quite nicely, and they display themselves in your closet. And when I use them, I move them from the right side to the left side so that I
you
know
know.
that they've been used.
All right, now that we're talking about wardrobe, really quickly, Gary, I wore this shirt specifically to see if you would publicly say something, but you do not like when I wear shirts that have checkers on.
Not a fan of the check
Why is
shirts.
that?
I don't know.
You don't like this
It's
shirt right now?
Totally a visceral thing.
Yeah,
and,
it is.
and this, it's fine for the podcast. I'm just
not-
talking about it for the
I get
podcast.
This is a
We have a different standard
different
that we try to adhere to.
All right, this was great.
Wonderful.
was
Gary, thank you
fantastic.
very much.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you for having me. This was definitely the apex of my week.
We
We'll
went
take
for
it.
career, but
Yeah.
we'll take week.
Yeah,
We'll take
week is about as far as we're going to go right now.
It's the apex of our career. How about that? We put it that way?
Yes, for
Yeah, the
sure. Of our
apex.
Wait a second,
podcast
you had
career.
Todd Hundley on.
That's true. We had Todd Hundley. We had Ron.
We had
but-
Todd Hundley and some wind.
You had
a
Nimmo,
lot of
you
them.
had Wilmer.
Right,
You're,
so
you're,
We're on a good run.
We're on a good run.
You
but
are on a
don't-
winning streak.
Don't undersell yourself here.
Well, you asked me and I showed up, and I'm very happy to have been part of your enterprise. And I hope you make some money at it someday.
Probably not.
Us too.
Gary Cohen, thank you, my friend.
A pleasure.